This is familiar turf for me. I'm grateful to the Dolans and to the Hidden Shamrock for hosting us here tonight. I used to come to this place in the days before I was a Jesuit, so I broke out in hives as I came through the door. It's a little strange, but nice to be here with all of you. Let me just, so I have a sense of this, how many of you went to a Jesuit high school? Raise your hand. Thanks. How many of you went to a Jesuit college or university? All right. How many of you went to both a Jesuit high school and a Jesuit college or university? Okay. How many of you are a part of a Jesuit parish? Okay. How many of you have been to a Charis event before? Okay, great. Good. How many of you have given to the Loyola Academy Annual Fund this year? Just a show of hands, yeah. We have the pledge forms in the back. I see one, I see two, yeah, okay. So I think the idea here is to say something about, yes, the intersection of faith and work. You know, that's a topic that gets a lot of mileage in these kind of talks. The entire Theology on Tap series was invented here in Chicago by Father John Cusick and Father Jack Wall, which still has a great life to it every summer in Chicago and around the world. There's often been these attempts to try to make that connection between the intersection of my life at work and my faith life. And really, it's a broader question than that. It's just, where's the integration of the different dimensions of my life and my faith as something that informs all of it? You've all had some experience of this Jesuit thing. And I'd argue that you've been formed by it, whether you realize it or not. The agenda that we have informing you in the schools and in the other works of the society are about shaping how you look at the world. And so what I would like to say as simply as possible is that this notion of an intersection between your work life and your faith life, it's almost an odd question to somebody that's been formed in the Jesuit way of looking at things, because all things are connected to your faith life in the Jesuit worldview. All things are a coherent whole in you as the person experiencing them. So in some sense, the Jesuit way of approaching this question is to say, well, duh, of course there's an intersection between what you do and who you are and who you're called to be. So let me just try and say, I'm not going to talk real long. Let me just say a few words about Ignatius, the person, and this Jesuit way of doing things, and how you've been formed in that, whether you realize it or not. It's sort of sinister. We get you through your youth, and we embed it in a curriculum, and we embed it in the messages that we're sending you all the time, and we embed it in a way of life. And then our master plan to take over the world is finally coming to fruition, because we got the papacy, and we have a couple of other topics that we're gonna get, and offices we're gonna hold. But until then, we're holding out, for the White House. But not even gonna go there. It's just way too easy. But so Ignatius, I'd argue that with Ignatius, there's so many things that are distinctive in the Jesuit educational tradition. For example, catchphrases like being women and men for others is coming from Father Pedro Arrupe, gives us a sense of a vision of what it means to be Jesuit educated, that somehow your heart and your life and your talent and your time on this earth is intended to be opened up into the service of others, and especially those most in need, and especially those at the periphery and at the margins, as the Pope so beautifully has demonstrated. But if I were to summarize Ignatius, St. Ignatius's view of things, and suggest that this is what's most important about having some sort of an integrated experience of your life, I'd say that it's his worldview. It's how he looked at the world, and I'd highlight two things. The first is, Ignatius has an unbelievably positive view of the world. He has an unbelievably positive anthropology, positive theology, and frankly, a positive ecclesiology. The way he looks at human beings, the way he looks at God, and the way he looks at the church are incredibly positive. One of the great Jesuit gurus, Howard Gray, likes to say that Ignatius functions with a hermeneutic of appreciation. Now, the hermeneutic is just the lens, right? It's the lens through which I look at the world. Some people, they'll talk about the hermeneutic of suspicion. For Ignatius, it's a hermeneutic of appreciation, that his fundamental orientation to every moment of his life became an appreciation and a gratitude for what is. because, the second point, he had become so utterly convinced that God could be experienced in all things. Not just found. We sometimes say finding God in all things, but it's more than that. The verb that Ignatius uses all the time is to feel God in all things, or maybe better for our American sensibilities, to experience God in all things. So a positive worldview and a sense of experiencing God in all things, and you begin to understand how the intersection of faith and work is almost a non-question to somebody formed in the Jesuit worldview, because it's all somehow a piece of a coherent puzzle that is you, and is you in this world, and is you in your experiences. Now remember, for Ignatius of Loyola, as he ultimately sort of evolves into this idea of forming a religious community, what would become the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits, or the better stated, the Compañía de Jesús, the companions of Jesus, the company of Jesus, Ignatius has this notion that the role of the Jesuits is wherever they were needed. And contrary to an image of like monks in a monastery whose vocation is in some sense to retreat from the normal realities of day-to-day life into the artificially created world of the monastery with its own rhythms and times, and focusing on a reserved retreat spirit of prayer, Ignatius instead wants to go in exactly the opposite direction and go where the action is. Now remember, it's because his worldview is so positive, it's because he trusts that God is in all things, which means nothing is profane, because everything has been touched by the sacred. And so that odd distinction that we Christians so often want to make between the sacred and the profane, Ignatius is much more comfortable living with this ambiguity of the mixture of these two realities in lived experience. All things have the potential to reveal God to me. All things have the potential to open up my experience of God in the world. St. Francis de Sales once said that every moment comes to us pregnant with the possibility of God. Will you midwife? Right? This is the question Francis de Sales asked. In other words, here it is, but you got to engage it. You got to notice it. You got to pay attention to it. So for Ignatius, there's a great Jesuit. One of my favorite historical Jesuits was a guy named Geronimo Nadal. It's a fabulous name. Geronimo Nadal. If I had children, I don't. If I had children, my first son would be Geronimo. It's just fantastic. Geronimo would be a fantastic boy's name today. Better than some of the ones I've been doing at baptisms lately. Like when someone will ask, I'll say, and what's the child's name? And they'll give me a name, and I don't want to embarrass anybody, but it'll be like a state name or a name of a neighborhood, that they've given to their child. And I'll say, oh, well, tell me about St. Brooklyn. And it gets awkward. Nonetheless, all God's children. So Geronimo Nadal is this very interesting character who's a contemporary of Ignatius. And Ignatius really was an organizational genius, and he had a great ability to perceive what somebody's gifts were and then to set them loose to do it, to use those gifts and those talents. So Nadal is a part of this early cohort of first Jesuits. And what Ignatius notices as a central gift of Nadal is this: he's a great salesman. He really understands how to articulate something and to sway somebody into understanding it. And I mean that in those sort of crass, secular terms. It wasn't that Ignatius said he's an extraordinary evangelizer talking about Jesus. He said this guy could sell anything. And Ignatius gave Nadal this job. Now think about this for a moment. Ignatius said, I want you to go to every Jesuit community in the world, which at that point wouldn't have been all that many. I want you to go to every Jesuit community there is and tell them what it means to be a Jesuit. Now remember that the reality of this is there's not a lot of written text that those early Jesuits would have. They don't have the constitutions, the documents that govern the Jesuits. They don't have those yet because Ignatius hasn't finished them. They don't likely have a lot of copies of the spiritual exercises. What they have is the experience of having done the spiritual exercises. That's what they share in common. But the culture hadn't been created yet of what this community was like. How do we organize ourselves? What are our houses supposed to be like? What's the day structure going to be like? Nadal would go to all these communities and he would tell them what was the mind of St. Ignatius. He would tell them, well, this is what it means to be a Jesuit. And the first thing that Nadal would do is he would emphatically and repeatedly state, we are not monks. And secondly, the world is our monastery. So the Jesuit worldview that's coming out of Ignatius's creative imagination is the world is the place where we pray and work. Remember, the methodology of a monastery is ora et labora, right? Prayer and work. That's the life of a monk. That's the life of a cloistered religious. What do? Our vocation is prayer and work. Well, Ignatius says, Our vocation, too, is ora et labora, prayer and work, but it's not in the confines of the monastery. Our mission is wherever the need is greatest. Go where the need is greatest. Go where the church needs us. And so Nadal articulates this by saying, we are not monks. The world is our monastery. And so Jesuits very early on, because of their theological and ecclesiological undergirding that comes from Ignatius, believe that their place is at the middle of town. Their place is where commerce and industry and politics and education come together. Why are Jesuits so often getting in trouble with popes or politicians? Because that's our mission in some ways. Our mission is to push against that. And when folks say, well, you shouldn't be involved in politics, and there's a wonderful things written when Pope Francis made his comments about Donald Trump recently. You know, sidebar, let's be really clear. Pope Francis doesn't have a clue who Donald Trump is. I don't think he really, now he does. But as he made those comments, his comments were about sort of a general reflection about, well, people who want to build walls to keep people out, that's not very Christian. His title is Pontifex. The word means bridge builder. So he's more into bridges than he is walls, right? And so he speaks those words about a politician. And then people, the internet lights up with all these people in their little caves typing out what was wrong with that and why is he getting involved in politics. And there were some wonderful things written in reaction to those pieces saying, well, of course the Pope should be involved in the politics. The reality is the Pope is a Jesuit and he doesn't know any better. He knows that his place, and he can't help himself, that his place is there where the experience of people is happening. This is why Jesuits, you can find Jesuits, and this isn't meant to be boastful or hubris, it's just an observation. That's why you find Jesuits who are anthropologists, who are physicists, who are theologians, who are social workers, who are doctors, who are lawyers, who are doing all sorts of different things. The reason that the Jesuits run the Vatican Observatory isn't because of the conspiracy theories of us taking over the cosmos, but because the church felt that they could trust these guys, and they happened to be the only ones that had sent some of their guys to go get degrees in physics. So Guy Consolmagno, the Jesuit brother who runs the Vatican Observatory, went to MIT and the University of Arizona and got his PhD in astrophysics, and he's a Jesuit who studies physics and looks at the stars on behalf of the Vatican. And so this monastery of the world becomes the Jesuit way of looking at things. So your work, what you do, whether you believe it or not, or whether you feel it or not, is holy work. And you're saying, yeah, you should see what I do. But the point of this is, where you are in your life is the intersection of God and this world. You, as the incarnate reality of God's embodiment in this world, this imago Dei, this image and likeness of God in the world, in you, in this unique nexus of relationships that is you, that place, you, that's where the church is at that moment. And that's where faith and work intersect in you. And you may say, well, my work's not particular, it's not church work, and it seems to be pointless sometimes, and it's such a grind. And I get it. But here's some questions to ponder. What's happening to me in the process of doing this work? God, what are you asking me to notice when I work and with the people I work? What is it you're calling me to observe, to notice, to pay attention to? What is it you're calling me to do next? What's the new horizon for me? How am I called to be companion to the people I work with? How do I bring to the people I work with some sense of hope? The second reading at Mass yesterday, as I'm sure you vividly remember, is St. Paul saying, we are ambassadors for Christ. It is as if God is appealing through us, Think about it for a moment. It doesn't say priests are ambassadors of Christ. It doesn't say religious are ambassadors of Christ. It doesn't say official churchy people are the ambassadors of Christ. It says you, fellow Christians, you are ambassadors for Christ. He goes further. It's as if Christ is appealing through you. And so the question becomes, what is it that people are experiencing at work in me? Is it an ambassador's role of bringing Christ to the world? I'm not talking about preaching at the water cooler. I'm not talking about bringing the Jimmy Swaggart floppy Bible into the middle of your workplace and beginning to testify against the sins of the office. Could be fun, but it's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking more about what St. Francis of Assisi is sometimes credited with saying, whether he said it or not, it's beautiful, which is preach the gospel at all times, use words when necessary. How do you live? How do you witness to the gospel and to the values of the gospel in who you are? Pope St. John Paul II once wrote that work, human labor, work is how we actualize our transcendental structures. I love that. Drop it at cocktail parties. It's a great phrase. You know, what'd you do this week? Well, I spent a lot of time actualizing my transcendental structures. And you? I was drunk at Hidden Shamrock on Monday night. What does it mean? The Pope says actualizing your transcendental structures. In other words, making real or actual the structures, the realities of who you are at a transcendental level. More directly stated, it means this. Work is one of the ways you become the person God created you to be. How is that going for you? How is your work contributing to that? How does your discernment about what you do and how long you'll do it and what the next step in your career might be and how you'll behave in the office tomorrow, how is all of that informing this pilgrimage, as Ignatius would say, of your life? This destiny, this ultimate direction of your life. The intersection of faith and work is you. The intersection of faith and work is you in the workplace, you in the community where you are. How is it that you are functioning as an ambassador for Christ in that? How is it that your work contributes to the greater good, the common good? How is it that you, in the context of your work, may contribute to the good, especially of those folks at the periphery? So Ignatius says to those first Jesuits, our job is to get out there. Now, I want you to listen to what Ignatius says and then think to yourself, who also in recent history has had a vision like this? Ignatius says, when I look at the church of my time, which is the church of the Reformation, when I look at the church of my time that seems to be fueled by fear, and when I look at the church of my time that seems to be fueled by fear and now a reaction against what's happening out there, which are the questions people are asking of this church, we're closing in on ourselves. We've become too self-referential. The walls have gotten too high. And the mission of the Jesuits and the church is to go outside the walls, extracurricular, to go outside the walls and to be the church on mission. Sound familiar? When Jorge Bergoglio spoke to the cardinals assembled in the Sistine Chapel, and each cardinal, if he wanted it, got 11 minutes, I don't know why, 11 minutes to speak to the other cardinals to this question: what does the church need to be today? And Jorge Bergoglio stood up and said to his fellow cardinals, all I know is we have become self-referential, and we have closed in on ourselves, and we are dying. And the only way to fix it, the only antidote for that closure, is to go out as missionaries, is to go into the world and remember that we are on mission. And he has tried to demonstrate through his actions and his travels and his personality that embodied reality. Notice, it's not simply, I will write an encyclical about this. It's, I will model what this looks like. And so whether he's making his way around St. Peter's Square and embracing the people who otherwise might be neglected, whether it's pulling the little children up to ride the Pope Mobile, or whether it's going to all these places in the world to make a statement by his presence that God is here with you at the periphery, and I'm coming to learn from you. Francis is quintessentially Jesuit when he talks about his model of church being, hey, we've got to stop closing in on ourselves. We've got to go out of ourselves, because if we become self-referential, then we are speaking a language that nobody cares about. And really, there's so little at stake in that conversation. Okay. Are you okay? Can I have 4 more minutes? No, thanks. You have Guinness? I'm good, thanks. So, yeah. It's Lent. I gave it up on Mondays. So Ignatius gives us not only a worldview, which suggests that God can be experienced in all things, and to approach the world with an attitude of gratitude or a hermeneutic of appreciation. Interestingly enough, Ignatius says, do you know what sin is? All sin is a failure of gratitude. Think about this for a moment. Ignatius was so overwhelmingly convinced by how much God had done for him, how much God was doing for him, and how much God would continue to do for him, that if he was but aware of what God was doing for him, his sin life would diminish greatly. If I can be aware of that, who could sin in the face of such great knowledge? My response is one of gratitude. So, there are no talks on spirituality or faith at work that are useful unless they give you something practical. So here's the practical part. Or maybe it's not, I don't know. I think Ignatius' whole spiritual tradition comes down to 3 movements, 3 things, 3 activities or habits. And you've already been exposed to them because you went to Jesuit schools. And we embedded it in the curriculum, and we embedded it in the way we ran things, and we embedded it in the culture that we tried to create there. Not perfectly, but intentionally. First, pay attention. Every great mystic has said that the spiritual life begins with awareness and attention. There are too many things happening around us that you are missing. For Francis de Sales, it was every moment pregnant with the possibility of God. For Ignatius, it was the opportunity to experience God in all things. It's to notice and to pay attention, to see differently, to see through those eyes of gratitude that suggest there's more here than meets the eye, to pay attention to those things and be moved by those things. Pedro Arrupe has that very, very famous quote that people have in calligraphy on their walls and on pillows on their couches. Arrupe has that wonderful quote about falling in love, right? Arrupe says the most important thing is to fall in love with God, and it will decide everything. It's what will break your heart. It's what will break your heart with joy. It's what will get you out of bed in the morning. It's what will make you, you. And that Ignatian spiritual tradition that Arrupe so beautifully articulates there is this. Are you seeing that? What are you missing in the course of a day? What's blowing past you and you're not noticing? And so the attentiveness is the first step. And the simplest way to do that is Ignatius' examen prayer, which has had this wonderful resurgence in the life of our schools as we teach that very explicitly to kids. To stop at some point in the day and ask this question, God, what do you want me to see? This is something I use at meetings at school all the time. I don't know that it would work in your office place, but every now and again in meetings at school, especially if they're kind of tense and unproductive, never happens at Loyola, but I've heard in other places it does. And if the meeting is sort of stagnating and there's maybe some tension in it, I'll just say, let's stop for 30 seconds of silence, and I want everyone to ask in the quiet of their heart, God, what do you want me to pay attention to right now? And people say, like, oh, he played the God card. Yeah, that's great. I guess he's going to win here. But what do you want me to see? What do you want me to pay attention to? The prayer of the examen, the key piece of the examen is, 1, make it a habit, because it needs to be a spiritual exercise so that you begin to have soul memory, like good athletes have muscle memory. And secondly, when doing the examen, seed your power. It's not you reviewing the day. It's you asking God to show you the last 24 hours. Let God use your memory. Let God use your imagination. Let God draw that into your consciousness. Pay attention. Secondly, Ignatius says, if you are attentive, if you pay attention, and if you ask God to help you see differently, you will be drawn to a spirit of gratitude. How could you not? At the very end of the spiritual exercises, Ignatius gives the final prayer exercise to a retreatant, which is translated a lot of different ways, but the contemplation to learn to love as God loves is one translation. It's a pretty good translation. And the prayer is simply this. Ignatius says, take some time to recall the graces of your life. Faces, places, experiences, highs and lows. Take a few moments, a couple of days, whatever it takes, to call to mind the graces of your lifetime, that you exist, that you have family, that you have friends, that you have had these moments, and it can be something very simple. Traffic wasn't bad this morning. I made every light. How about that? To think of those things that have just been little blessings and grand, significant, life-changing blessings. Ignatius says, now just sit with that for a little while. Just sit with those graces for a little bit and be grateful for it. And don't you feel churning inside of you some sense of gratitude for all of that? And if you do, Ignatius says, if you do, then what's the appropriate response? Well, he says, pray in these or similar words. Take, Lord, and receive my liberty, my memory, my understanding, my entire will. You've given all of this to me. Now I return of it. Use it, God. Use me. Teach me how to love like you love, to use who I am and what I have in the way that you would have me do that. Teach me how to love. Teach me how to be generous, how to serve you as you deserve, and to give and not to count the cost. And so Ignatius's movement is this: attention, gratitude, and then let's call the third movement charity, love in action. Learning that central, goofy Christian calculus, which is if you want to get your life, if you want to get the life you were sent here to live, if you want to become the person that God created you to be, if you want a life of meaning and purpose, then learn how to give yourself away generously. Learn how to share your time and your talents with those in need. Learn that goofy lesson that Jesus repeats over and over again. If you really want to be assured of losing what is most essentially you, then cling to it greedily. But if you want to get your life, if you want to find yourself, to use some 70s lingo, then learn how to let it go and give yourself away. And in the transaction, the love is multiplied and you become yourself. The intersection of faith and work is you. And that intersection will be richer and fuller to the extent that we can enter into a spiritual reawakening like Ignatius suggests here in something like attention, gratitude, and service. The final thing I'd say to you, and this is I hope not surprising to anybody, but we're not intended to do this alone. This faith journey, this life of ours, is not intended to be an isolated, individualistic experience. Father Adolfo Nicolas, who's the Superior General of the Jesuits these days, has this wonderful thing he's been saying all over the world lately. He's been talking to Jesuits all over. Now, he travels to every continent and sees every conceivable culture when he visits the Jesuits. So this guy's got a worldview. And when he speaks to these communities these days, he says this: I am deeply concerned that we are currently suffering in our world from a globalization of superficiality, that we have become very superficial people. We are awash in information and we are thirsting for meaning. There is so much flying at us every day that we don't go deep into anything. We make decisions quickly and we don't discern. And you can't discern if you don't take the time to dig deep, to reflect, and to really see what's going on. And this globalization of superficiality, he suggests, is alienating us from each other. Because we were meant for each other. We were built for community. We are hardwired for companionship. We are sent into this world to be together. And so my last plea for you is this: if you want to enhance the experience of the intersection of faith and work in your life, if you want some help becoming the person God created you to be, get connected to a faith community. Whether it's engaging the programming that Charis offers, or more importantly, I think, whether it's to get engaged in a parish. And I know I hear from you all the time, you don't like it, or it's not offering anything that speaks to me, or the homilies are awful, or I don't like the liturgy there. I hear you. I get it. But there's a lot of places where it's happening in good, inviting, affirming, community-building, spirited ways that speak to your experience. Find those places. Go to those places. Change those places. Breathe life into those places. Bring your questions to those places. Because the church desperately needs you to breathe that life and that hope into what we're trying to be as a church. And you will be fed by the life of this organization, this community, this church that wants you to find the deepest possible meaning, not just in the intersection of faith and work, but in the purpose and the direction and the transcendental structures of your life. I pray that you find that. I pray that we can be helpful, we Jesuits here in Chicago, those institutions that you're connected to and the mission of the Society of Jesus in this area. I hope we can help you with that. It's such a privilege to do that together. Thanks so much for being here.